So you're probably watching us on a Monday morning or Monday afternoon. If you watched us on Friday, we touched on the 131 years since the pioneer column arrived and some of the developments in our economy and in our healthcare sector. But there were a couple of issues that we left untouched on and that we'd like to really go a little bit deeper into.
A rabbit hole segment.
Yes, a rabbit hole segment, a hangover segment, as one of our keen followers calls it. Simba, you talked about a few key medical developments since 1890. But when you really boil it down and drill down to the core, was it good for us? Was it bad for us? And also, as you're answering that, I'd just like you to think about medical developments in the rest of the world. So in this period, we discovered germs, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And the whole world moved forward anyway. So how much of our progress do you ascribe to the arrival of the pioneer column?
Okay, well, good question, George. The first thing is, during the 20th century, there was a lot of progress in terms of medicine, right? What we call modern medicine today didn't exist in 1900. Even if you look at what happened in the First World War in terms of medical corps and medical service versus the Second World War versus post-World War II, what we know and how we practice medicine vastly changed. The way protocols have become the routine, the way medical services are regimented, specialists for things. And the fact that we don't believe bloodletting is the answer to things, or bloodletting was a very well described cure.
Or zapping people's brains.
Exactly. Psychiatrists.
Or leeches.
Exactly. So, as long as you stayed plugged in to information, you were going to improve nonetheless. It was going to be.
Would we be where we are? So on Friday you mentioned people like Andrew Fleming.
It's still Friday, my guy.
They're watching it on Monday. You mentioned the likes of Andrew Fleming and a few other names that I can't remember now.
Yeah.
Without them, would we be where we are?
So obviously the model of medicine that we practice today is based on, quote unquote, the Western model, which came with the settlers. So without them, it's unlikely we would have had that model of medicine. We had a different model of medicine, and Michael Gelfand, after whom a lot of things are named, including a private clinic here in Harare, he's probably one of the most well-researched authors of that generation from the European doctors, who actually went and tried to understand how African medicine worked. And he had a lot of his works that were there, but he was actually the first professor of African medicine in the University of Rhodesia then. And one of the things he went into detail about how African medicine worked.
It worked
and didn't work.
Well, it worked and didn't work. I think that for everything, right? There's nothing that's 100% and there's nothing that doesn't completely work. So I think there's evidence for certain herbal things. Some things work with a placebo. There's some things that will get better by themselves. So whether you chew that leaf or steam with that zumbani, sometimes your condition will get better regardless, right? And some things are inevitably going to get worse regardless of treatment. So I do firmly believe that there was some traditional medicine that we practiced which had roles. So if you've got a fever, if I've got a leaf that breaks a fever, that's good for you. If I've got something that treats pain, that's good for you. I may not have antifungal therapies, but that's probably what's going to kill you.
But I've got a view.
Mm-hmm.
You always have a view.
I do, and so do you, George, and so does Rufaro, and that's what makes this interesting. What I'm confused by is you almost assuming that the Asians weren't coming.
And the Arabs.
And the Arabs weren't coming, and yet they brought with them a lot of additional knowledge around different forms of treatment. Indians, Chinese.
And they were here already.
Yes, well, and
I don't know about the Chinese
and
then.
they are still here.
Yeah, I don't know about the Chinese then, but I know here in our part of the world, there's a lot of Portuguese influence.
Yes,
right, and we accept that. Probably further north, there was a lot of Arabic influence and through trade, etc.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of really moving the needle moved when that pioneer column hit. And I think that's when a lot of changes happened in terms of the way we live today, how we live today, how we're educated, how we communicate, how business happens. That needle moved post 1890.
So you're pro-colonialization.
No, not really, but that's the world I know.
So what are you pro? Give us what you're
I'm
pro.
not going to go back to.
No, but
We don't know if he's pro anything.
Okay, please defend him.
I can't go back to Chivu now, right? It's just too late.
No, look, gentlemen, I think we've got to interface with reality. And in as much as, for the most part, we can, in terms of modern 21st century values, all agree that imperial colonialism was evil, right? That doesn't stop us from identifying some of the benefits of it, right? It in as much as they had an agenda which was to benefit capitals on the other side of the equator in Europe, we benefited somehow from that development that happened pursuant to that agenda. So I think recognizing that, like Simba is doing, is not to endorse it and say this was a wonderful thing that happened to Africa. It's just to speak to the reality on the ground that we did benefit in certain ways from being colonized. So you're not you don't have to be a Rhodes or apologist of imperial colonialism to concede that it did come with some benefits.
Okay, so name some of the benefits. Okay.
He's been speaking to that, and also education, right? I think that if you look at the pre-independence periods of South Africa and Zimbabwe, for example, and you look at Rhodesia's policy towards educating the majority and the apartheid regime's policy towards educating its majority, Bantu education in the Rhodesian system, chalk and cheese, right? Which is why we are all articulate in English.
And that makes us educated, right? We're fine specimens of English, education because we can speak English.
Well, that's an anecdote, but I'm saying the two models were completely different, and the education levels, I think Zimbabweans have a reputation across the globe of being one of the most educated population in the world.
Does it still hold water today?
No.
Well, today,
41 years into independence, are we still one of the most educated countries in the world?
Well,
perhaps not.
Certainly one of the most unemployed.
The permanent secretary of education was on the news a couple of weeks ago, benchmarking teacher attendance to 70%. So her statement was along the lines that such and such a percentage of schools in the country is okay because 70% of the teachers show
That
up.
means she said people should borrow money to go to work.
Yes.
But look, we're doing really interesting things in this part of the world. We're giving people $50 at official rate
To go shopping in South Africa.
and there was an announcement about
So what's
civil
your point?
servants going to South Africa.
Okay, that was fake news.
Oh, it was?
Yes.
Okay. All right. My bad.
Well, the fact that it was fake doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. Well, the minister says it was fake, so we've got to leave.
But the point I'm trying to make is that to the extent that things aren't working right now, it's not a function of what was happening pre-1980.
I'm confused. What's your point?
No, so when we talk, like you're making the point that education today is a mess, right? And I'm saying that that's a recent development in our history. This has not always been the case. So I think the 1980s and the 1990s, the standard of education in this part of the world was arguably world class, and things have deteriorated from there. And that has got nothing to do with a legacy of colonialism.
I agree with you. And I think it's very difficult to name one industry or one aspect that hasn't collapsed over the last 2 decades, be it infrastructure, be it health, be it education, be it roads and power generation. It's very hard to actually say, well, that's improved since 1981, right?
Well, I think that's unfair.
Okay, you tell me.
Okay, yeah,
What's
so-
improved? What's
You're
good?
right. It's not fair.
There's a lot more schools.
Quantity
There
versus
are-
A
quality.
lot more clinics and
A lot
hospitals.
more
Quantity versus quality?
But a lot more people have access to
Okay.
education and healthcare.
Fair.
A lot more people have access to economic opportunity.
Did you say economic opportunity? Did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
Did you just say that?
Yes, because
In this economy?
But George is not talking about indigenization.
well, there's indigenization, but there's also 50 years ago, how many black people would occupy the positions in business and in commerce that we do, or even in the medical
Okay, but
profession?
that's a disingenuous
What's in
comparison,
disingenuous
because
about
what we're not talking about, because I was very specific. I said that in the 1980s and 90s we had world class education and things have collapsed, and he took that further to describe other things that have collapsed since the 90s. Okay, so what we're talking about is, we're not talking about today versus 1950 when black people needed a pass to go to certain suburbs. We're talking about today versus 1990.
I think you guys just made up your own
2000.
question.
No, we didn't.
How
We are
1990 and not 1890?
No. And the reason that came about is we were explaining that in 1980 we inherited certain infrastructure, a certain policy framework, and it actually lasted for almost 2 decades, and it worked reasonably well before it started coming apart at the seams. So that comparison to 1950 doesn't
To
address
1890.
Well, okay, so in 1890, we were an Iron Age peasant population.
Wow, peasant. I don't like the word peasant. I think the word
We were
peasant-
traded.
The word peasant is terrible. That suggests that
In
you are a
1890.
landless individual who lives on someone else's land. I think we were
We had land?
hunter-gatherers, we had land, we kept cattle.
By 1890, we were beyond hunter gathering.
And we were not peasants.
We were
per se.
pastoralists.
like
We were farmers.
Exactly.
We were traders. Great Zimbabwe
Yeah.
was built on trading.
What percentage of the population was trading? Come on. It's like today
The
if
only-
we say that we are bankers and doctors and lawyers and accountants. Come on. What percentage of
There were only 300,000 of us.
I don't think we were peasants though.
Okay.
Well, I think what you're talking about two things trying to achieve the same thing. I think the idea of being a peasant is, one, you're landless, you work on the land. Two, you are getting paid for working on the land. Three, you don't determine what you get paid. And what I see Rufaro trying to refer to about peasants is he's giving the blanket view that you're just a person of no means.
But were we people of no means?
So we're peasants,
sure
we're
not.
peasants today.
If you've had cattle before in 1890 and you have cattle now, you're considered wealthy. If you have cattle in the communal areas, from the point you have 5 cattle onwards, you're considered a person of means.
And so in 1890, didn't we have cattle?
Of course we did. But this
Yeah, but
is
what percentage of the population?
Was there anyone who didn't have cattle?
Everybody had cattle. The population was small. There was actually a lot more cattle then than people.
We did, when these people came along and said we have to work, we didn't understand why they wanted us to work.
But that's
We were-
because they brought capitalism, which we didn't have. We had socialism.
So were we poor?
Yes.
Were we poor and were we of no means?
No, but then that whole system was eradicated through the hut tax. The hut tax meant that if you're an African man and you didn't want to work, you had to give them your cattle. And that's how...
But I'm sorry, gentlemen, are you trying to make the point that quality of life should be aspirational to us?
Were we worse off than people of similar status in the rest of the world? So, yes, my ancestor in 1890...
Hunter-gatherers, the
We were
Khoisan
not- we were-
worse off than hunter-gatherers in some remote place
we
in
were
the Amazon?
not hunter-gatherers.
we had our own system.
Yes, we were Iron Age. What's
think the world has changed.
the politically correct expression?
We were beyond
Not
Iron
peasants.
We were beyond Iron
we were
Age.
Iron
I think
Age
the
what?
world has
What did-
changed remarkably. I think the world has vastly changed from 1890. So regardless of where you are in the world, I think there's very few places that still remain the way they are. And if you look at the gigantic leaps that Southeast Asia has made, that the European continent has made, that the Americas have made, even Africa itself, and there's multiple influences from colonization. That was a reason for a lot of changes. But the world wars, massive changes, and the Cold War in itself, and whatever other things happened post-Cold War. So it's very hard to then make those comparisons that George was saying, to say, should, actually, it was Rufaro was saying, should we aspire to where we were in 1890? Should that be the modern?
Should that be the gold standard?
Yes.
Where most of us wouldn't have been born.
But everyone else, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. The world has changed irreversibly and will never be the same again.
But that doesn't mean that there aren't causal forces out there that change things, right? So if you look at the world has changed, I completely agree with what you're saying. But if you look at North Korea versus South Korea, right? That's
example.
He likes to pick that example.
he's just my favorite example. It's a beautiful example because the North Koreans and the South Koreans are genetically almost identical, but they took two paths because they had two different
same names,
and it's just chalk and cheese, right? And I think that we should apply that thinking to this part of the world to say, if we had been left to our own devices, if the pioneer column came to this part of the world in 1890 and said, you know what, this part, let me run this thought.
Okay, you gotta be quick because we gotta go for a break.
Well, we are having a drink, but look, let me run this thought experiment, right? If in 1884 in Berlin, when they had this conference to draw up these borders, they'd said, you know what, this part that is today Zimbabwe, we're just going to leave them alone and run an experiment to see how things go, right? Do you where do you think we'd be?
They did it with a place called Ethiopia.
And
where are they?
Did they or did they fail?
They failed to colonize Ethiopia.
But this was actually very interesting because
it's the Italians who failed to colonize Ethiopia. You should have sent the Germans there. They would have colonized it.
And it's so interesting.
But is Ethiopia anymore
so true? Mussolini's forces briefly occupied Ethiopia for
about 2 minutes.
Probably about 7 months or a year, until imperial forces, imperial in quotes, and mostly African, actually kicked the Italians out with British resources and Allied resources. So
what's your point?
No, just a bit of history.
Yeah. So
is Ethiopia experiment? Look, wait, but is Ethiopia?
We don't have a functional airline. Ethiopia does.
Well, they've got a nice airline. I don't know.
Yes,
it's more than functional.
Yes,
it actually operates.
But wait a minute. Let's be fair. What has helped countries like Ethiopia and countries like Botswana has always been that period when colonialism and imperialism was rife. There was never an interest in Botswana, never an interest in Ethiopia.
No, there was interest in Botswana, but the Tswanas did a deal with the crown, and they became a protectorate instead of a colony.
But there wasn't serious interest. They had nothing.
They thought it was
a waste of time.
Yes.
But here's the thing. All the countries that did not have an active interest of a colonial or imperial power have benefited over time. And that time may be 100 years, but what's happened is there's been no interest. And then suddenly in the instances of Botswana, there was diamonds. And then in the interest of Ethiopia, guess what? There was some massive investments from an Indian company called Karaturi, the world's biggest flower maker. They wanted to be close to Europe. They can fly flowers to Europe every day on an A380 full of flowers. And just their investment alone was $3 billion. And then walk in the Chinese, guess what? Minimum investment now in Ethiopia, 20 billion, including this infamous dam. All of that is a function of the fact that there were no prior interests ahead of what is now the new world.
So you don't think it's got anything to do with the current rule of law?
No, this is about 2 minutes old.
Oh, no. Why don't they sort out the situation in Tigray first? That should tell you how quickly they can sort out issues about rule of law. And I think if you read correctly, they're having a hard time in applying rule of law in Tigray.
No, but that's his point. That the Chinese are there because of the mess. But
no,
really,
because the Chinese have an alternative view. The thing is, we're trying to say the British and the Americans and the French and the Italians must have the same values as the Chinese and the Indians, and that is the basis for that understanding. That's a wrong.
Well, I'm not sure about we, but okay.
It's a wrong premise. What we're seeing for the first time in over 200 years is new values, and new values are being considered to be bad values.
I think people have had different values throughout human history.
But
I don't
these
think
values
there's
now
anything
have
new about
capital
that.
to support them, which wasn't the case before. It's a lot like saying a Zimbabwean value system should not be sold to the world. It can be sold to the world. Do we have enough money to support our Zimbabwean view in the outside world?
I think you know the answer to that.
But the Chinese do, and the Indians do, and that's what they're doing.
Gentlemen, I think we're about as far down this rabbit hole as we are down this bottle. Maybe it's a good moment to say goodbye to our audience.
Before they get bored of us.
Yes. It's been lovely having you along. Not sure if any of this made sense, but hopefully it inspired thoughts, inspired discussions. And as we participate in these thoughts and these discussions, hopefully we can make our country a better place. The kind of place that we all dream about. Have a lovely week. COVID is real. Stay safe. Be good. If you can't be good, be good at it.
Cheers.
As always.
Cheers.
Cheers.